Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Piotr Żakowiecki, and I'm a senior analyst for health issues in Politica Insight. I have a pleasure of conducting this webinar today entitled the European Plan of Combating Cancer. We will offer simultaneous interpretation, so please make sure that you are using the latest Zoom app, desktop client or Zoom app. You can find details on that in the chat. You can also ask questions using our chat.
So, good morning, everyone. My name is Piotr Żakowiecki, and I'm Politica Insight Senior Healthcare Analyst. And I will have the pleasure of hosting today's event entitled Europe's Beating Cancer Plan, Opportunities for Poland. Before we begin, a short technical note. The meeting will be held both in English and Polish, and we are providing simultaneous translation. So please make sure that you have an updated version of the Zoom app, either desktop client or the mobile one. And for more information, please check our chat. Also, please feel free to ask questions in the chat module. So, without further ado, I would like to welcome you to our first session entitled How is Europe Tackling Cancer? The European Priorities in the Fight Against Cancer, and introduce our panelists, starting alphabetically. We have with us Mr. Bartosz Arłukowicz, MEP, the chair of European Parliament's Special Committee on Beating Cancer and former Polish Minister of Health. Witam, panie pośle.
Welcome. Good morning.
Professor Bengt Jonsson, Professor Emeritus of Health Economics at the Stockholm School of Economics and expert of the Swedish Institute for Health Economics. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you.
And last but not least, we have Dr. Bettina Rill, who hasn't phoned in yet, but we hope that the connection will be provided soon. So, but yeah, Dr. Rill is member of Horizon Europe Cancer Mission Board and former chair of Patient Advocates Working Group at the European Society for Medical Oncology. So, to lock us in on the topic of cancer care and cancer strategy, I would like to invite Professor Jonsson to shed some light on the current trends in cancer care and how the different European countries compare in this area. So, Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be part of this conference. And of course, I would have liked, as I've done several times before, to be able to see you all personally in Warsaw. But I'll hope that this technology will work well as well. I'm a health economist, and I'm going to give first about a 10 minutes introduction, some data about the resource use for cancer care, because I think that the resources we have available for cancer care and how we are using them are extremely important in any cancer plan aimed at improving the outcome for patients. And I will use some slides, and I try to share them with you on the screen here. So I put on the first slide here, and I will use some data from a report on resource use and disease burden and access to valuable cancer medicines in Europe. So I will have a European perspective, but I will try to make also some comments on where is Poland in this European perspective, where are the similarities and where are the differences. And I'll see if I can change my. Now it's come here. I just to start on with cancer and cancer mortality, just to make the point that we have seen enormous progress in cancer care over the last decades, and I think it's most visible in the reduction in the death in the younger age groups in cancer. That's been a very promising development. But we also know that we have an increase in the incidence of cancer, particularly in the elderly, And then with the increasing incidence, we also have an increasing mortality in the end. So we have a disease where both the disease burden is reduced, but also where it is increasing. And looking at the disease burden, I think we are used to see that it's cardiovascular diseases which are on the top of the disease burden. And the slide I'm showing you here is the burden of disease in disease-adjusted life years, which is an aggregate measure of disease burden in terms of mortality and morbidity. And you can see that due to the progress in the treatment and prevention of cardiovascular diseases is already declining, while cancer is increasing, and in 2016 accounted for 20% of the total disease burden. And I think it will soon take over as the primary disease burden. And actually in many countries, we can see that cancer is already the main disease burden. And that's of course interesting to know, because resource use and disease burden is of course has to be discussed together. So if we are looking at the cost of cancer, where we have data in the report I'm talking to you from 2018, I think we can first, as you see on this figure here, we look at the very big differences in the cost of cancer care per capita in the European countries. We see it's up to 500 euro per capita in some of those countries which spend most on cancer care. The European average is around 200 euro per capita. And if we are looking at Poland, which is to the left, as you see, rather down to the left of the figure, it is, if we take the price adjusted, the PPP adjusted spending, it's about half of the European level. And if we don't adjust for prices, it's even lower. It's just between 50 and 60 euro. And I think this is very important, because also we know that the international development of cancer care and cancer therapies obviously comes at the price. And for countries with a lower GDP per capita and lower healthcare expenditure per capita, they also have less resources to spend on cancer. But if we are looking at the European scene, and then we can see that Poland is very similar to the other European countries in the terms of what share of healthcare expenditure which is spent on cancer. Poland is a little in the high level, around 7%, while the European average is around 6%. But I think the general picture is that actually over the last 20 years, we have not seen an increase in the share of resources going to cancer. And that may be a little surprising, but I will come back to the explanation for this as well. It is rather interesting that if we compare Europe with the American healthcare system, in US they spend, of course, twice as much per capita on healthcare than Europe, but they spend about the same share of the total healthcare expenditure on cancer. I was talking about that there is, of course, significant changes in the way we are spending resources on cancer over time. And you can see on the figure here, if you look at Europe to the left end of the figure here, you can see that the share we are spending on cancer medicines has increased from about 20 to 30%. And this has increased in all countries. And if we are looking at Poland in 2018, the share of the spending on cancer medicines is about as a share of the total expenditure on cancer, it is about the same. You may be a little surprised that while we see this increase in the spending of cancer medicines over time, why has not the total cost of cancer increased? And here you have a figure where the blue bars shows the development of the cost of cancer. And we can see a steady increase, but it's an increase in line with the overall healthcare expenditure. I think what the good thing, the reason that the total healthcare expenditure has not increased, while at the same time we have increased the spending on cancer medicine, is that we have reduced the spending on inpatient care for cancer in about the same amount during this period of time. But I would like also, if I'm making a forecast for the future, we also know that with the declining use of hospitalizations, etc., we cannot continue to have cost savings to the same extent as in the previous decades. So I think that with the disease burden of cancer increasing, we probably have to be prepared to increase spending on cancer as well. Just a few words on the indirect cost, which you can see here is declining over time. And that's, of course, due to the reduction in mortality due to cancer. It's a significant benefit that we have been able to reduce mortality. People could work, and they could work while they have treatment, and they can work because they are not dying from cancer at an early age. So that's a very promising development. And I can just see here about an example, and this is the growing number of cancer medicines, which you have seen over time, which comes now up to about 10, 12 medicines every year, new cancer medicines, and maybe 15, 16 new indications. And over this period, 95 to 2018, there is 180 new medicines approved. And we should remember that in 1994, before we are starting this curve, there were only 40 cancer drugs introduced during the whole period until then. So it's new opportunities which we have for cancer care. But of course also that gives us increased opportunities to do something, but it also gives us important choices, because we have to make choices which of these medicines should be used in which combination for which patients, etc. And the choices are getting more difficult because we need a lot of information about the patient, the drugs, the diagnosis, etc. And of course also the opportunity cost of making the wrong choices is increasing as well, because if we are using the new medicines or other treatments in a wrong way, we are obviously not getting any outcome, and we are losing the money which we are spending. So we can see here that this is the cost of cancer medicines. And here, of course, we could see that it's the access to cancer medicines in the European healthcare system is very much linked to the level of the economy and to the total healthcare spending. If we are talking about access to valuable modern medicines, the medicines come slower, and they come to a less extent to the countries in Europe which has lower healthcare expenditure and GDP per capita. And of course, as you see here, Poland belongs to this. And the reason for this is, of course, that the international medicine, they have an international price, and that means, of course, that for countries with the lower income levels they are relatively more expensive, and I will come I will come back to that. And this is just a figure which shows that over the period, last 10-year period, where we are looking at countries with lower incomes, middle incomes, and on the upper tier with the 5 big European countries, we can see a very clear picture. It is, of course, that the use and access to the newest cancer medicines, which is the one in blue and red here, that is much less in particular in the lower countries with a lower income and spending on healthcare. And if we look at, for example, a new treatment opportunity in cancer care, the immunotherapy, which is a new and very promising field, we can, of course, also see here, we see two things, which is very important. We see large differences, even between the countries with the higher income, but we also see a clear difference in the magnitude of use of these medicines between the countries with the lower incomes and the higher incomes. And I think there's two lessons here which are important both for Europe and for Poland, is of course that we have to be better on using these medicines for the right patients and using the valuable medicines, and we have to also to try to address the problem that actually some countries in Europe has not as fast access as the others. So what we are talking about here, and I'm coming to my last slides here, is of course that we are spending money on cancer to take care of cancer patients, but also to try to improve patients' outcomes. And while we are getting more and more opportunities to R&D for diagnostics, for early detection, prevention, treatment, etc., our resources are limited. And we also know in these days with COVID-19 and the significant pressure on healthcare system to spend on this disease, we also know that cancer patients and resources for cancer patients has been reduced. So what we have to do very carefully is to look at how we are spending our resources and look at which resources actually have a better, which medicines, which treatment, which diagnosis is most valuable for the patient, and we have to allocate those resources. So we need to use the scarce resources in a cost-effective and efficient way to ensure value for money for patients and taxpayers. And well, what do we do for that? Well, it's a lot about economic aspects, and that is the first is that the prices must be aligned with ability to pay in countries with different income per capita. And I think that here is not only how much we are paying, but also how we are paying. I think that the fact that we are paying per dose, per pack, per etc., is a problem. I think that payment for cancer treatment like a service per patient, that should be the new modality, which will be different by indication. So we pay more for those indications with high value, and it also helps the problem to pay for combination therapy. And then, of course, we also, of course, need to have an accountability and statistics how we are actually using our resources. So just like to end that if we are linking up to the European Beating Cancer Plan, I think that my main message is that we need to have data on how much resources we are spending on cancer and how those resources are devoted to different actions. And then, of course, we need better data on the cost effectiveness of different potential uses of resources so that we can direct the resource use to those areas where they benefit patients mostly. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor, for this very interesting and informative presentation. Just as a short follow-up question, if you don't mind, you pointed out a few targets that we should strive for in general. I mean, the policy goals that should be pursued in order to improve the access to medicines. But what would you say is the biggest challenge in terms of policymaking, health policymaking, as you can see it across the board in different European countries in general, for making these strides? I would suggest, I mean, I suppose you mentioned data sharing and data analysis for this, but what else?
Well, I think the major challenge which we have now is to say there's a number of new opportunities which coming on. It's a new cancer medicines, but it is also new diagnostic. It's also new options for doing early detection and so on and so forth. I think I guess it's particular with cancer medicines. They come to the market now usually at an accelerated rate. They come with less data than we need to actually make these. We don't have comparative studies where we are comparing the use of resources for specific patient groups for different actions. We don't have studies with patient relevant outcomes on overall survival, quality of life, etc. So I think that the first real challenge we have here is, of course, that on a European scale, because we all are basically saying we have the same technology, the patients are very similar, the data we need in order to make informed decisions how to best use resources. That's something which is a European asset which we can work on together, and particularly now when cancer medicines and other technologies are developed for small groups of patients, and that also means that we need to have a collaboration at the European level to produce these data. And I think that we have to do progress on two. We have to do progress in what data we are getting before the products get to the market. But we also need to do more research. We have to spend more money on research on the cost and cost effectiveness of different resource uses in the national context, for example, in Poland as well as in Sweden and other countries, because we cannot have all the data needed to make these choices, but we need, when we don't have the data, we need to do the studies in clinical practice when the medicines are available.
Okay, so just to maybe repeat a phrase that is often found in many academic papers, somewhere around the conclusion, more research in this area is needed and validated. Professor,
well, I think that but just say the good thing is, of course, that behind the increased spending, for example, on cancer medicines, is a huge increase in the research, particularly in the private pharmaceutical industry. And they have developed a range of very promising drugs. But we also need to have the information how to use these new medicines in the best possible way. And here we need a combination of public and private research, how to make the best use of the options. Because if we don't have the data on the outcomes and cost effectiveness, then we can't really have a true cancer plan which makes cancer, the promising development in cancer, coming to the benefits of patients.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Professor. I would like to turn now to MEP Bartosz Arłukowicz and ask a few questions about the working of the committee that he's heading. Panie pośle, słyszymy się. Witam.
Mr. Arłukowicz, can you hear me? I would like to start with a short introduction because much is now happening around the plan. Many groups, initiatives within the European institutions and surrounding institutions, public and private agents are now participating. So where is your team in all that, and what are the main goals of your team?
Well, setting up a special committee at the European Parliament is a key development, because when we were discussing about the health, and this discussion has been ongoing for a long time, we were declaring that we as Poland will try to make sure that we will try to convince our colleagues that Europe and the European Parliament should deal with a problem which is, I think, one of the key problems in the EU. If Europe can jointly construct roads, if we have the common agricultural policy, financial policy, we also need to take on a tough challenge on tackling the cancer. I know what are the treaties, I know what are the provisions of the treaties. We know that the health is in the remit of the nations. However, the cancer is a civilization challenge that we are facing, and it is facing Poland, Europe, and the world. And if we don't take it head on, we are not going to ever win. And then the COVID came, the pandemic came, and it showed very clearly that the combat with the virus which stopped the economies, the virus which put everyone in a lockdown, and this kind of event showed us that we need to be consolidated in our fight with cancer. That's why we established this committee, because we wanted to make everyone aware that we have some disproportions when it comes to the treatment of cancer, that patients have various opportunities depending on where they live. And it's not that a patient in Eastern or Southern Europe has the same opportunities as the one in the Western Europe. We need to show what are the differences in terms of the spending. We need to develop a certain strategies which will be common strategy, including prevention, education, fast diagnosis, which is very important, then an access to novel therapies, and rehabilitation following the treatment. And also, we have to remember that quite often this problem is not being confronted, that some of the patients following the treatment face some stigma. They have a problem to take a loan. So our challenge is to develop a standard strategy whereby all the nation and member states would cooperate with the European committee. We met with the health commissioner in order to coordinate the activities of the parliament and the European Commission. Of course, right now the work is quite difficult because we are under pandemic. We held virtual meetings, which is not easy to invite the patients, and this is how we envision it. We would like to talk to experts face to face, but this is right now impossible. But we are trying to make some headway under the difficult circumstances. The ambition of this committee is to undertake on the challenge. We would like to develop certain databases. We would like to exchange best practices. We would like to take on a very difficult challenge. In 2012, let me remind you, when I was a health minister, we had a critical shortage of the cancer drugs. 16 countries faced cancer drugs shortage. We were able to respond to it very quickly because we cooperated. So I'm also thinking about some other ministers, and I think that in the future we will not have this shortage crisis. We had some supply problems in 2012. I wouldn't like to put the blame on any specific company, but the patients were in a very difficult spot. So we would like to prevent it in the future and to make sure that the critical drugs are always available and that we always have a mechanism of common purchase or common stock as the EU, because I think this is just necessary. I would go even further. I know the treaties and I know that common price negotiations would be a good instrument. When I was the health minister, I was talking to the companies, and I think this is one of the most challenging part of every minister's remit. Negotiations with companies is very difficult. Mr. MEP, do you think that a more effective strategy when it comes to the access to drugs would be the intergovernmental mechanisms or the pan-European mechanism? Because I understand that these common negotiations were just your common initiative, but where do you see the role for the European Commission? What kind of mechanisms would you envision? How realistic it is? Well, you cannot force any member states, but the interests are common. In the treaties, we know that health is the prerogative of every member state. Of course, we could change it in the future, but COVID has proven that if Europe is facing the largest health crisis that we've seen in the decades, the European Commission has some tools to ensure the common purchases of ventilators, PPEs, or vaccines. I would like to remind you that the committee said that it is going to purchase a huge amount of vaccines, so some barriers will overcome. And I think that when we finally
nie tylko Europa, też nie wymaga specjalnych rozwiązań. Czy ten rak musi być
mastered on some other challenges? Because this is another civilization challenge. Mr. MP, the final two questions. You mentioned about various areas, and the strategy of the committee within 4 pillars is covering all the aspects of oncological care. Which area for you is a priority for you? And a short question, what is the closest milestone that we can look up to when it comes to European Commission, and also when it comes to the cooperation with the European Commission? Let me start with the second question. It is difficult to foresee. The committee has its competences to work for 1 year when we were setting up this committee. And nobody thought at that time what will be the scale of the pandemics, what will be the timeline of the pandemics. We didn't realize that. So the pandemics is modifying the work of our committee, and I'm going to talk to European leaders to prolong the work of this committee, because the work in online mode is much less effective than under a normal circumstances. And also we are facing some difficulties. For example, so we want to talk to an expert, and he is unavailable because he is dealing with COVID. And we also see what is the interlink between COVID and oncology. We see the postponements and delays when it comes to diagnosis of oncology due to COVID. I think that the real effect of the COVID we will see in a dozen or so months, when the Polish and European patients will be overflowing with the patients who had some complications because their cancer were not diagnosed. So this is a real challenge. And I think that we'll have to talk to the president of the European Parliament to prolong the work of our committee, because even the health committee postponed their presentation of their plan, because right now the whole focus is on COVID combat, on the greatest crisis. So I think we have to remember about it. I cannot right now foresee it should work for 1 year. What is your priority, personal priority? I haven't mentioned because you asked me about the personal priority. Well, for me personally, what is very important is the area that I was active in is the rare cancers, especially in children. Here, the exchange of information between researchers is very instrumental. Access to very rare and very expensive drugs, clinical trials, clinical studies, and developing second opinion systems, so that to have a system which would probably be financed by European Commission, under which we could consult our doubts with our other colleagues from across Europe. These are very important things. I'm also making some efforts to create in Europe a special base of non-typical causes of quite common cancers. Because we have the cancers which are usually going in a typical way, but there is this 2% of those which are untypical, which are unconventional, and that's why we should have a database. For me, this is a challenge and task for the European Commission and for European Union. These databases should support the nurses, the doctors, and I think that the EU has the tools and should use it. Thank you very much.
We have Dr. Rill with us, finally. Thank you for joining. Are you unmuted?
Yes, I am.
Oh, yeah, great, thanks. Okay, so I wanted to following up on what we've just been talking about the work of the Commission and
Yes.
the European Parliament. Well, you represent patient organizations, and you've been doing that for quite a while now. And from your perspective and experience, how would you say, to what extent is the European Commission's approach patient-centric enough? And also, how does this compare to the way patient organizations are involved in developing cancer plans in different countries? Just some general idea of what are some great practices and not so good ones. If you could shed some light on this.
Sure. Thank you very much for the question. And first, apologies that I was late. I was in a panel discussion at ECHO, and I hadn't realized the time overlap, and I couldn't leave. So I apologize for that. So I am a member of the Cancer Mission Board as patient representative, and I am actually working on the recommendation for personalized medicine. And by background, I'm a medic, and I have a PhD in molecular biology. So I can I look at it, I think, from different perspectives. First, thank you very much for being here, the invitation. I feel very honored, and I must say your translation is amazing. The translator, thank you very much. That was just, I'm very impressed. So to go to the previous speaker, why I think this is, can really fully support. We have to realize that we're going into an area of increasing personalization, and we have already rare cancers and rare diseases, if you think about it, but we are all becoming more and more rare. That means that our small countries, I'm German by origin, that's 80 million people. I live now in Sweden, we're 10 million. That's a very different story. So if we really want to provide the best possible care for increasingly smaller patient population, we have to work together. There is no way out because we cannot beat the numbers of our population. So I think collaboration is critical, and that we agree on standards, we collaborate and find best possible solutions for that. I must say I'm quite, the mission concept is something we've never done before, and we just discussed that on the last panel session. And I actually think it is a different way to think about science, to think about problems that gives everyone the chance to participate. I think we often think of the European Commission as like a top-down approach that runs programs, and this is a very different way to interact. And that is, I think, where patient organizations play an increasingly important role, because I think if you really look at the ecosystem, everyone has vested interest. The only one who wants best outcomes, or no one wants outcomes more than the patient themselves. No one wants progress, speed more than the patients themselves, because they're the ones with the skin in the game. So I believe the role is increasing. It comes with needs for education, because this is highly complex, and we will have to provide that for patients if we want them to contribute to our societies. Just to the last bit is I very much agree also on the need for getting better at early detection. Now, what we have seen in cancer under COVID, I've just helped like my colleague working in Romania, very much like as in Poland, we have seen a dramatic decrease in early detection. And I'm really, really worried about the wave that we are expecting. So I think we all have to come up with a structure how we increase or get better. This is the time to really put something, put brain, energy and organization into early detection, because that is the only way that we're going to prevent this wave that's coming towards us, and that really scares me. So and I believe our networks can support that.
Right.
Thank you.
Just to expand slightly on the cancer mission, because maybe not everyone in our audience would be familiar with it. This is one of the 5 R&D initiatives of the European Commission, and what is the focus there? Because I'm trying to tie this a bit to what Professor Jonsson was talking about in terms of access to data, research, data sharing, and also the aspect of managing scarce resources. Because, like, as we probably all can tell, I mean, there can always be more money spent on healthcare. This is somehow, you know, it's a bottomless pit, so to speak, or some might say. And on the other hand, we have very scarce resources, especially, for instance, in Poland. The access to personnel, doctors and nurses is really scarce, and especially in some very narrow specializations like children oncology, for instance. So how would you say the work that you do within the mission fits into this, and what would you say are you know the ways the Commission or other European institutions can move things forward for the member states?
So I've been thinking actually about this question a lot. So first, one step back for those who are not familiar with the mission concept. So the European Commission charged Mariana Mazzucato to analyze what was going on like this in terms of research. And it was her recommendation to use a mission-based approach to tackle the vexing problems of our European society. And everyone, of course, thinks like, you know, man on the moon as a comparison, which I personally don't really like, because cancer is not one person on one moon, it's many problems. And if we look at problems, or if we look at the granularity we need to get right in Europe, our societies are different, our cultures are different, our systems work in different ways. We have different strengths and weaknesses. So we need something that is locally working. You know, no one can decide in one place what's good for someone else. That's absolutely arrogant, so not working that way, but it's inappropriate. It's not effective. People know they see what's wrong in front of them. And I think the missions can facilitate that approach. So I think more of it that, you know, we want to give people smart tools to think about their problems, to help them solve the problems themselves. There will not be endless money. There will never be enough money, as you already said. So I don't think that's the right way to think about it. I have now in the last month been like, well, I feel actually privileged. I've been talking to very many people around working in the ecosystem of personalized medicine. I'm humbled how much time they're willing to spend to, you know, teach me, simply to show me their view of the world, their expertise, and they're very, very deep. But what I've noticed is that most people lack a broad view. So they have the detail, but they don't see the impact of their actions a few steps further on. And I think that's the problem we are currently facing. We have expertise very local, but we don't make it accessible. So I think by investing in this accessibility link, we can, for example, bridge problems like lack of expertise. We're not going to grow pathologists overnight. We're not going to grow pediatric oncologists overnight. So what do? Are we going to wait a generation? Of course not. I mean, but why do we have telemedicine? So I think we have to, you know, now it's an opportunity I want a system that works for everyone. And if there was a point to get it right, it's now. With COVID, everyone has understood health is a good. It's a valuable good to our societies. If we don't use it now, you know, I mean, when are we ever going to learn? So I think it's more about using what we have in the most effective way for the benefit of all. And for that, we have to be honest what benefit for all means. We have to make sure we align. And then I actually think I have already seen what happens just by talking to people, by putting people into context, what happens, what you can generate just by connecting. I think we have to think more that way. And then the rest will follow. So I'm actually more optimistic now than I was at the start. So I do think this is a good way to go for all of us.
That's great to hear. Professor Janssen, just a similar question. You mentioned a few of the, I mean, the idea of managing scarce resources and using certain technologies or certain digital solutions for that. Could you please expand on this a bit? And like, what tools could be used both at the national level, at national health policy making level, and at the European level for that scarce resource management to work?
Well, first of all, I'd like to reiterate that, of course, we need the data. We have seen now with the epidemic and the consequences for cancer care how important allocation of resources for diagnosis, for treatment, etc. I think that we have seen how important this is, and that's of course so important to know how much resources we are spending and how those resources are related to the burden of the disease and the problems which patients are facing, and so that's very, very important. But it's not enough to have the data. We know that, and that's so many studies of the healthcare system showing that maybe a quarter or 1/3 of all healthcare resources is spent on actions which are very low value or on no value at all.
What would be an example of such low value action?
Well, you can look in you look in the U.S. program, for example, of choosing wisely. That is, for example, when it could be anything from prevention to early detection to treatments, etc. I think there's a lot of examples. If you are looking at, for example, the use of cancer drugs in the UK drug fund and so on, you can see that a lot of new cancer medicines are prescribed where there's no evidence of outcome, and they are not prescribed for the right patient. So there's a lot of evidence, but what we need, of course, is to have more, because in most countries, and I think Poland is one of them, you really have no data, for example, how cancer medicines are prescribed, for which patients, for which indications. And if we are talking about personalized medicine, which of course is here, it's of course that we, in order to have the relevant data, we need to have the relevant patient information in terms of the molecular characteristic of their cancer, etc. So the problem is that we are so far behind in having this data. But then, of course, data is not enough. I would point as an economist to one thing, and that is what we are paying for. If we are paying for the wrong things, we are getting the wrong things. And if we are not paying for the right things, we are not getting the right. So, for example, payment mechanisms and reimbursement decisions are also. So I certainly agree enormously well with a cancer mission approach, that in all research, there is a purpose, and the purpose is to improve the outcomes for patients. I think this is a great way ahead, but that also has some consequences, that we need to improve the translational research so that we are having this information. And when I'm looking, for example, on personalized medicines, yes, it's a lot of discussions and talk about personalized medicine, but I think we have 10 new diagnostics coming on every day, but there's hardly any data on how these are used, which are the ones which are most valuable, which we shouldn't use, etc. So I think that it's a fantastic situation. We have the European Cancer Plan, we have a cancer mission, and I think we have a committee for cancer in the European Parliament. I think we are really up on the horse, but someone has to tell us in which direction we should ride.
Thank you. I would have just another question to MEP Arłukowicz. I hope, Panie pośle, czy jest pan z nami jeszcze?
Mr. Arłukowicz, are you still with us? Right, excellent, because I couldn't see you there. In that same context, I would like to ask another question. What is your evaluation of the possible impact of the European Commission and everything else that is now being discussed around the plan in the European Commission. So what's the effect of that on the national policies, on national strategies? To what extent do these ideas and initiatives that are associated with, for instance, data standardization and data exchange, do they translate onto the national level? What is the responsiveness of various governments?
I think there is a number of tools. I think we should develop a network of standardized centers which would follow the common oncology standards, and the patients would know that he can expect certain standard. And the second idea that I encourage my colleagues to, whether we should not have a special financial mechanism. For example, if in a given country we have a standardized level of access to the diagnostic tools, the given country can have some special instruments which could help to translate the same system to other countries, so that all the countries have the same system, so that we have a standardized level. Also, when it comes to prophylactics, prevention, right now it all within the remit of the member states, and we see the differences when it comes to the access to diagnostics. In some countries, we have an easy access to mammography, 70–80%. There are countries when the access is 15 or 20%. So there is a huge difference. Well, it's well corresponds to one of the questions that I see. To which extent do you think that a matter of registering new therapies is a barrier? How the European institutions could improve? You have to repeat the question because I didn't hear it. Well, referring to one of the questions that I received from our listeners, to which extent do you think that the speed of the registration of new therapies at the European level could be a barrier when it comes to the access? Is this pace right, or EMA should be streamlined? I think that this matter should be undertaken within the work of our Commission, but also European Commission, because the procedures need to be very transparent. We are talking about the safety of the patients, but also we cannot create too much red tape. So minimizing the red tape and bureaucracy is a very big challenge, and EMA, I think, should make its operations more flexible and streamline itself, because we have to cut the time which is needed for procedures, and that hurts the patients. So, of course, the registration time of new therapies is key, or the new drugs, but we also have to remember about safety. We cannot accelerate too much, because we are talking about the patients who are very seriously ill, who are often fighting for their life directly. So the drugs needs to be carefully studied, but we need to cut the red tape and bureaucracy. And I think that one of the principles that I would like to describe, I generally think that the more Europe in health, the more health in Europe. This is my principle. I think this is quite an optimistic accent. I would like to, because we are moving on to the end of our session, I would like to ask the final question to all the panelists, because our event, co Państwo uznaliby,
all the member states, stemming from the working on the beating cancer, Europe's beating cancer strategy. Maybe Professor Jensen, if you could just shortly comment on this.
Well, it's looking at the what's happening at the European level. I think that what we really share is the cancer is a common problem for all people, and in Europe we basically have the same options for managing cancer in different ways. I think that what the most important for us is to collaborate about generating the research and the data needed to make it possible for us within our healthcare systems, which of course is every nation has to make their allocation of resources. But what we can share is the cost of generating the data which we need to make the good choices, to sharing those costs, and also sharing those results between the countries. I think that's a very important European project, and that's where I would like that the cancer mission and also the beating cancer plan should focus on.
Thank you. Dr. Rill, what would you consider the biggest opportunity here?
I couldn't agree more with Bengt, actually, because I think it also at the problems mentioned earlier on, the introduction of new therapies is complicated because, I mean, we have a centralized regulatory system, so that would be the European Medicines Agencies. But then every country looks at it in an independent way in a health technology assessment. And this is usually where the delays come in, because it's so hard to generate the evidence that, as we have just heard, to really know whether you can trust it or not. And I believe that if we sort this out in there are introductory schemes. If you look, for example, what Italy has been doing for many years, if you read what the London School of Economics has published in recommendations, there are ideas, but they're all small scale. And that's not the fastest way to learn. If we just introduced and learned, and then every country can adapt accordingly, I think that's where the real power of going together comes from. And of course, we need data standards that are of high quality, otherwise we're not going to learn. We have to agree on them, and everyone has to stick to them. But I do believe this is possible, and the EU, in my opinion, can provide the support for that, so that everyone can benefit, that we adopt. And that's why I think that this is like a golden moment in time, how I think about it.
Right. Panie pośle?
Tak, ja chciałem dopowiedzieć.
Yes, I just wanted to say one thing in the context of last question. In my opinion, everything is important when we are talking about, but the whole future in the fight of the cancer is dependent on one word, which is courage. Either Europe will be courageous and bold to face up to the challenge of cancer or not. This is the singular decision. So European Health Union, would you say so? Well, I'm not so sure, but we have to remember that cancer is not a challenge for healthcare system, but it's a civilizational challenge for the whole of Europe. Health is one thing, and cancer is a civilization and social public problem. And this is not only a health problem, it is a civilizational problem. W takim razie...
Coming to an end of our session, so I would like to thank our panel for a great discussion and very informative as well. And well, under normal non-COVID circumstances, I would invite everyone to coffee stations for chatting. But this is something we're going to have to wait for. Hopefully, sometime next year, such events will be back. But for now, thank you so much once again. Professor Jensen, Dr. Rill, and MEP Arłukowicz. And now we're moving on to our second session. So if we could have, just a switch of. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. And just a quick note to everyone in our audience who might have tuned in a bit later after the introduction. The event is held both in English and Polish. There is a simultaneous translation going on, provided that you have the latest version of the Zoom app. So make sure you have it. We'll be turning to Polish for this particular session, since most of our speakers are Polish. Więc rozpoczynamy drugą sesję.
So we start the second session of our session, whether the strategy will change and improve the situation in Poland. I would like to welcome our panelists. Let me start in alphabetical order. Professor Marcin Czech, who is the president-elect of the Oncological Union and former Deputy Minister of Health. And Ninka Finstra, who is also joining us. I would like to welcome you warmly.
Thank you very much for having me.
Bardzo dziękuję. And Professor Rutkowski, who is the director of the Soft Tissue Cancers and Study Center. We are very sorry, but Mr. Gadomski, which was supposed to take part in the meeting, was summoned to the parliament. We have an unusual situation in our Polish parliament, so unfortunately he had to attend, but we hope that the discussion will be equally interesting. We'll try to make up for that and to make the discussion very interesting. We will start with a presentation which will bring some context and will talk about some strategic activities. It will be presented by Professor Marcin Czech. Thank you very much. I will try, just like Professor Jonsson, my former teacher in pharma economics. I will try to show you the presentation. I don't see it.
Tak, widać.
Okay, we can see it. I think you can see my presentation. I think we will get it right. Let me. Can you see this presentation? I have a presenter type. Well, I think this is how it should work.
Nie pomogło.
Idealnie.
Super, teraz tylko się... O, super, przerzucają się już.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I only have 10 minutes, so I will quickly talk through the slides. Let me start from a general overview on the situation of the cancer diseases. So a few facts in lieu of the introduction, and then I will tell you what the report presented by Professor Jonsson is contributing as a kind of recommendation to our health system, and then I will move on to the National Oncological Strategy, which is probably the most important document, which is already available in the public space. In the second part, I will focus on certain activities which the system is executing, and at the end, a few words on the trends and perspectives. I think that Professor Jonsson has already covered it. 20% of life is lost in Europe every year, the so-called DALI, the cancer diseases are very serious in Europe. This is a huge civilizational problem. It will directly affect 40% of people. There is also a very negative I think that up to 45% of the cases can be prevented thanks to an early diagnosis, some screening programs, vaccinations. When it comes to the costs, because this is an important aspect, the costs of cancer treatment in the general cost is 1.3, so 103 billion euro. We can even get to 173 when we add to it some additional costs. We can see that the disadvantage of the systems which are aiming at preventing the cancers is the fragmentation of activities, insufficient coordination and insufficient financing, which is exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemics, which it has already been mentioned, is creating additional burden. We also see an escalating cost of treatment and a huge variety of the diagnostics, and we need to choose those which are most cost effective. Ladies and gentlemen, what are the main conclusions from the Swedish Institute for Health Economics, IHE? Poland has one of the highest incidence rates for cancers in Europe, and even though the morbidity rate is close to the EU average, a pessimistic rate is that the survivability in Poland is very low, and Poland is ranking as the last. What are the main problems that we face, and what are the main reasons? Our society is quickly aging. The older persons means we have more cancer diseases. We don't have a systemic complex approach to the whole treatment, even though we are trying to make some steps towards it. We have an insufficient level of prevention prophylactics, both the primary and secondary, and also limited access to novel therapies. So Swedish Institute for Health Economics formulated 3 priority areas. First, ensuring the sufficient financing at all the stages of treatment, enlarging prophylactics and screening. The professor mentioned about the dynamically changing the financing model. The second is accelerating the time for acquiring new therapies, which is called the enlargement of the refund system, and increasing the investment in innovation. When it comes to the strategic goals of the national strategy of oncology, we don't see here in the strategy many references to drugs. Maybe that the authors of the strategy thought that all these elements are defined in a different government document, which is the drugs and medicines strategy. I think it is important to take a look at other systemic activities which are trying to order the system or to organize it in a way which optimally serves the interest of the oncological patients. Please let me refer to 2 publications which were in the public space recently. Cancer Innovations, developed by both economists and doctors, and here the innovation in these therapies are a very important part. This is chapter 5 and 6 as an element of the overall system. I'm showing you the table of contents to show you how very complex this approach needs to be in order to successfully treat cancers. Here are some other systemic activities which aimed at therapies. The development of drug therapies in treatment of cancer patients, showing the decision makers which areas, which molecules can be most interesting from the viewpoint of making a decision. Ladies and gentlemen, what we've seen happening in the overall healthcare system is the shift from the national oncological strategy or the drug policy through some acts, laws and ordinances to a organizational of the system, for example, cancer units. And at the very bottom, we have some specific implementing executive decisions. And this is how we should treat it in a cascade way. On this slide, you can see one overview of the drug policy, where you can see many references to cancer diseases, which are both the health and drug policy priorities. We have vaccinations, we have it laid out. Without getting too much into details in this priority goals, you can see that the comments of Professor Janssens, for example, on efficiency, stable financing level, are the elements which are common also for these goals. What are some specific activities under the system in Poland? So increasing the number of therapeutic options, enlarging the drug programs, setting up a special medical research agencies, or changes in the law which would lead to reducing bureaucracy in conducting clinical trials. So under the system we see a lot, and this is the best proof, the list of the new drugs. This table was quite large. Now moving on to, at the end of my presentation, to trends and perspectives and the changes which may touch on the market of drugs, which can influence this market. The first point is the revision of the Refund Act, which would involve many changes, making it much easier to make decisions on a refund and defining the prices of cancer drugs. Also introducing some risk-sharing instruments and also medical registers. This is a new approach to some therapies which are time-limited. For example, we have this kind of therapy in leukemia, and we need to have a different approach because the length of our decisions is fixed under the law. And the second are some joint therapies which are aimed at radical solutions. The subpopulation selected based on the molecular diagnostics. Here we also would like to see some improvements in the law which would improve and streamline the system. Molecular diagnostics is quite well defined in our plan. And then at therapy, which is at our fingertips, the genetic and cell therapies, they also require a different approach when it comes to the timeline, the financing forms, RRS, and so on and so forth. The second important point are solutions when it comes to medical fund. We've already passed it. It will refer to oncology and rare diseases, also rare cancers. We will see what the agency and how the agency will define the therapies of high therapeutic value. Ladies and gentlemen, moving on to the final part of my presentation, quite a few important trends which could also streamline our oncological care system when it comes to the drugs. This is what I'm mostly focusing on. It is updating the contents of the drug programs and the refund list, moving some selected drugs from drug programs to chemotherapy catalog in order to move the patients from the most costly treatment in the hospitals to earlier stages, which are not so costly, not so expensive, where we can intervene at a lower price. This is also moving some therapies within the treatment line, also reforming as I'm saying, the movement of these therapies within the line of treatment. And we need to streamline definitely the decision-making process. And we have a ready national program for rare diseases, including the rare cancers. And here MCDA in the refund of drugs which are applied in the rare diseases. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank you, and I think I made my timeline, and hoping that it will be an interesting introduction to this fascinating discussion. I will get over the voice to the host. The presentation, Professor, the presentation was wonderful, and it gives us a nice summary of where we are. Well, as a quick follow-up, it occurred to me to which extent these priorities or the one you describe or will happen in the future have a defined goal of reducing the inequality to an oncological care, because I have a sense that this is not explicit. It is like a product of some other activities. For example, reducing the cost, rationalization of therapy, accelerating the access, or streamlining the process. But do you have a sense that somewhere within the system that we have, of many regulations, many mechanisms, this patient-centric perspective and the goal of reducing the inequality and increasing the equity is also present and taken into account? It's a very good question, very interesting question. Thank you very much for this question. In Poland, we have a problem with inequality in healthcare in general. It is enough to listen to Professor Wojtyniak and his lectures. You will see that even the epidemiological parameter, the life expectancy varies, whether you are from the city, whether you are from the village, whether you are from the east part of Poland, the west part of Poland. Please remember, and I only had 10 minutes, so I had to run, I had to dash through my presentation. Please remember that every ordering activity of the system lead to the situation where more patients have an equitable access to the system. So everything which is described in the national program for combating cancer diseases or oncological program, from the prevention through research, access, through training of doctors, is aiming at making sure that the patient is helped from the very beginning when we have the suspicion that he is a cancer patient. And then we are trying to zero in on this patient-centric approach, from the family doctor through the specialist and diagnostics, molecular, then monitoring, and so on. This is the idea of the coordinated care, which is also connected with value-based therapy. Thank you very much. Well, moving on to Professor Piotr Rutkowski, I wanted to ask a question on the assumptions and the practice. Professor Rutkowski, you represent the National Oncology Institute, which probably is the most important clinical institution in Poland, but also you participated in creation of the strategy. In one of the recent interviews, you mentioned that the national oncology strategy is suspended, so to speak, is a kind of a suspended state. So I understand that the assumptions, this quite reasonable approach at the level of the concept, is not being implemented, it's just suspended. We know we have COVID, we have all these challenges, but could you share your perspective?
Thank you very much for this question. You've already revealed some things. Professor Czech also did. The situation is, it's not that nothing is happening. However, COVID did quite a lot. Unfortunately, Minister Gadomski is not with us here, but we did spoke on that even today. And I think the ministry is doing whatever it can to create a recovery plan when it comes to oncology as well, because oncology was not only strategically sort of hurt, despite a lot of expenditure that's been put into oncology recently. We see what's happening. We see the problems that the patients are facing. They are not reaching healthcare facilities. They do not have access to early diagnostics. Prophylaxis has also dropped considerably, and this is something that, well, some preventive diagnostic tests are now in 2 digits in some provinces. So this is very low, and this is one of the basics when it comes to national strategy as well. What Professor Czech mentioned, yes, that's true. The national strategy is meant to equalize access, because we've got external inequalities in Poland. The fact that that our healthcare system is quite far sometimes from what we see in Western countries, but we also have internal inequalities between cities, rural areas, and also province to province. And this is very clear when you, for instance, look at the density of oncology centers or the number of physicians and nurses. But coming back to the national strategy now, I would say the following. There are 5 areas under that strategy, and it's difficult to choose the most important one. But I think from my point of view, the most important one is access and prevention. And I'm talking both primary and secondary prevention. Something has happened here, as sugar tax, for instance, has been introduced. There is a lot happening in terms of education of the population, planning long life. There is a program entitled like that. And I think, well, taking into account various educational and awareness activities that have been taken in recent years, this is one of the best, I would say, the best programs that have been developed to increase awareness of the society regarding your own influence on your own health when it comes to prevention, primary and secondary. Let me interrupt you. I'm sorry, let me interrupt you. It's sort of a tricky question, but that campaign, these educational activities, is it measured in any way, the effectiveness of that? Well, we do have strong measures in the national strategy. However, it's too early now to say anything, because that strategy was adopted back in February. Now it's November. So really, much of the tasks that have been planned are now delayed, and they will happen end of this year, beginning of next year. So these measures are not here yet. But I can say is that owing to the collaboration between the Ministry of Health, National Health Fund, and the National Institute of Oncology, we are very close to publishing an opening report focusing on 7 malignancies, a sort of indicator malignancies, both for the national strategy and the National Oncology Network. Some of them overlap, some don't. But it's very important, because we really want to use big data, maximize the use of big data, not to generate additional data, although within our coordinated care network, this additional data is going to be needed. It's going to be collected, and it is going to be needed to analyze efficacy, because we know what the situation is under the pilot program of the National Oncology Network. We did see that we lacked data. This data is now flowing in. So there will be an opening report. It's not really showing that before 2017, 2018, it wasn't so bad, to be honest, because incidence was rising, costs were rising of oncology care. Professor Czech mentioned that before, but also previous speakers talked about it. But when it comes to some malignancies, we also had increases in survival. And it was significant. So it's not that everything is so completely wrong, it's so completely bad. Unfortunately, this first indicator year, 2020, has been affected so much by the pandemic. We know that, well, we have heard that, up to 45% of a reduction when it comes to issued DNO cards and surgical procedures. So this is a problem, this reduction. But what else is happening now? We are now working on the National Oncology Portal. We are working on guidelines, and these guidelines that have a sort of a legal standing. They are done according to HTA indicators, and they are a very important element when it comes to getting rid of inequalities. Because if guidelines are the same for Poland, it means that you have to employ them. You have to use them, whether you are in a smallest township somewhere in Lubelskie province or in Warsaw or in Poznań or wherever. So this is another element, and this work is already happening. It's going on. One more thing, also important. In some actions, we are actually ahead of the plan. For instance, the Agency of Health Technology Assessment has done a huge job this year. Professor Czech mentioned that the participation of oncology in competitions for clinical trials is high, 40% of won competitions focusing on oncology. So there's going to be a sort of a jump by several hundreds% in the number of non-commercial oncology studies opening in Poland. Also, centers for support of clinical trials. They will make the quality of providing services to our citizens better. Access to clinical trials is going to get better, because this is one of the elements of inequality in Poland. Unfortunately, if you compare us against other Western countries and you calculate that by the number of citizens. I see that you have a question to me. Yes, because I just wanted very shortly to ask one more thing. There is a number of actions that you're enumerating. The strategy and all the accompanying initiatives are, well, very broad, to say the least. But what, in your opinion, is a priority, really, from your point of view, in order to improve the quality of oncology care? What should happen? What has to happen first and foremost? How do you order it logically? Well, definitely the plan of improving, right from the beginning of next year, improving access and improving prevention. Primary and secondary prevention in Poland. These two things, I think, well, primary prevention is also there. It's available, and HPV vaccinations, for instance, are an element of that. But also monitoring of tobacco and the tax, sugar tax. This is also an element of primary prevention. So this is well, secondary prevention is, for instance, mammography, colonoscopy. And I think this is very, very important, because we are talking about the type of malignancies. Minister Niedzielski was talking about that. In fact, he was talking about the introduction of system of screening tests for lung cancer in the at-risk groups of Poles. So I'm talking about the malignancies where we have largest potential effect to be exerted. And the second point is coordination, definitely coordination. So broader introduction of the National Oncology Network. I think it would be very helpful if, well, oncology centers, in terms of pandemics, they sort of stood their ground in a way, but many benefits, healthcare benefits, are provided in smaller facilities that were completely closed during the pandemic. They completely gave up on the opportunity of providing these services to patients. So if we had a better coordination at the provincial level, then, for instance, we could have a hotline for patients telling them where to go, where to be referred. It's not working for now. So it really shows you how important the network is. Still, the European cancer beating plan is also sometimes mentioned. And along with MEP Arłukiewicz, we actually discussed that, and we added some of our support of our Polish ideas to that initiative. Well, from the point of view of Poland, when we talk about Polish national strategy, it seems to be very much in line with the goals of the European strategy. There are no doubts here, but there are some actions that can be taken at the European level, like, for instance, more emphasis on anti-tobacco policy. This is a huge lobby on the European level. These lobbying actions could be very beneficial. So the public health issues, but not only that, because we have already heard today from Bartosz Arłukowicz the situation of rare malignancies, rare cancers, because this is something that we are truly missing out on. In theory, we've got cross-border healthcare and access to therapy, but it's not really working. It's not fully operational. There is a network of referential centers like Eurocan, but you cannot reasonably consult a patient there. I'm talking about diagnostics mostly. So like second opinion that we could really use, especially in case of rare cancers, rare malignancies on the European level. And Bettina Riel actually talked about that before. On the European level, we would really use some sort of standardization when it comes to molecular diagnostics, and a constant set that should be available in every country. And it should be really executed, because it really ruins the situation for us in terms of many drugs from precision medicine. Lung cancer patients do not undergo proper molecular diagnostics. So we do have a drug program, yes, that's true, but many patients will not be able to be eligible for the drug because they are missing out on some diagnostics. So I think this is something that needs some ordering on the European level. If we had this full set, established set, it would really help some countries. Countries like Lithuania or Latvia, they may not even have access to full panel of tests for their citizens, because it is difficult for countries of that size, and they would deserve additional help when we talk about oncology care on a European level, because this is a challenge for all of our citizens. It's not just a challenge for a single healthcare system. Right, thank you. Continuing on the notion of priorities, I would like to ask a question to Ninka Fenstra. What would you say from the perspective of
should be the priorities in terms of reducing inequalities in cancer care? Because obviously without the pharmaceutical industry, there are no therapies to speak of. Same goes with diagnostics to some extent, definitely. But yeah, I mean, how would you rate those priorities in order? And also, how does the dialogue between the different stakeholders look like now when it comes to discussing the inequalities and the priorities?
So another question. Let me try to answer that as concise as possible. There's several inequalities, as Professor Czech has already indicated. We start on a bad foot just simply by the prevalence being higher. And by having a longer waiting time for diagnostics and treatments, unfortunately, Poland now ranks last when it comes to survival rates in the European Union. So the inequality issue that the Polish oncology care is facing is huge. These inequalities also stem from inequalities in investments in healthcare. As Professor Johnson has also shown, there are large differences there when it comes to overall investments in healthcare, where we, for example, see that investments in medications in Poland is only 0.5% of GDP, whereas in other Visegrad countries, it can lead up to 1.2%. That's a significant difference. We also see that's a much lower uptake of modern medication that has been shown to immensely contribute to improved outcomes in oncology. So these inequalities are super high on the list to be addressed. Then how to address that, or how to prioritize that? And I think I'd like to echo what also Dr. Riel said, and having a clear vision, having our mission statement almost where to go. And building on what Professor Rutkowski said, saying that we need to have patients treated according to medical guidelines could be a great way to align everyone behind there. Because with all the initiatives and passion we see, I still don't see a clear alignment where we really want to land. Everyone wants to improve diagnostics, everyone wants to improve access, but where do we really want to land? And why not state, as all partners contributing to improving patient outcomes, that we want to reach that, to make sure that all Polish patients can get access and treatment according to medical guidelines. That's a scientific, objective source, and why would Polish patients not deserve that? And then if we're aligned on that, we can prioritize accordingly, because we can't do everything at once. We clearly see that the challenges that we're facing are too fast to all address at the same time. So let's build it stepwise from that ambitious goal. When you talk about dialogue and partnering, INFARMA is very willing to partner to bring that forward. And we think we're very well placed for that for several reasons. And not only because the therapeutic innovations that have been brought to patients all across the world have significantly contributed to reducing mortality, improving quality of care, reducing suffering of patients. So that's already a very logical reason to have a seat at the table. But also because we see what works in a lot of countries. An advantage of working with global companies is that we have experience by bringing these therapeutic innovations to different healthcare systems with different standards of care. with different challenges. And we can leverage those insights to see what would really work best in Poland. We have that knowledge, and we're very willing to contribute an open dialogue to bring that forward. We're also happy to see that since the last few years, the dialogue has increased, and we're willing to continue that. Of course, we realize that COVID now plays a huge role, and that the level of dialogue might now temporarily a bit lower. We're very welcome to bring that back to a higher level to, as said, leverage the insight we have on the disease, on the therapeutic innovations, but also on how those innovations have really been leveraged to increase patient outcomes in the most optimal way in other countries, to the benefit as well for Polish patients.
Would you also say that there are some maybe good practices that could be introduced in the Polish system when it comes to the dialogue and the way in which the industry and the regulators are collaborating on different access issues, for instance?
A specific good practice is difficult to share, but I would just like to say it in general, the challenges we face are so vast, that's clear. And every stakeholder in healthcare looks through that challenge through a different lens. And we need to bring those ideas forward. I don't think at this moment there's one single party who can address all the challenges effectively by themselves. It's simply too big. So we need to really combine forces, Ministry of Health, policymakers, all the passionate healthcare professionals that take care of these patients every day, but also in the pharmaceutical industry, to look through our lens and bring ideas to the table and ideate based on that. I think by truly bringing all the ideas from different perspectives to the table and have an open, constructive dialogue, together we can come to solutions. And if we bring those ideas to the table together, implementation will be easier, because we all understand the way we look at the same challenge, so we can all play a role in executing that. So I think it's not only necessary to have a seat at the table to come to a right solution, but I think it will greatly facilitate any implementation of any solution we will then jointly go to, as long as we're indeed aligned on a common objective. And that should ideally be mission stated. And why not, again, referring back to those guidelines and making sure how we can get there as soon as possible for Polish patients.
Okay, that's very interesting. Thanks. Panie profesorze Czech.
Back to Professor Czech now. I would like to ask a question about a notion that actually recurred, that we heard about frequently, and I'm talking about the obvious circumstances that we are in now, the pandemic. Sometimes you called it a health debt that we have incurred now. How could you present that health debt? How would you illustrate it? Do you see it in the data? We know about the DILO cards. These are the cards showing that prevention is being reduced, and early diagnostics as well. Right, prevention and early diagnostics is now being limited at the general practice levels, but also talking about drug programs, chemotherapy, all the data that illustrate access to therapy. Do you see any reductions there? And or perhaps that health debt can worsen existing inequalities?
I think that the idea of the medical debt is not my idea, it's not my copyright. I think that Professor Rutkowski could say a bit more about practice. I think the debt will be increasing when it comes to those undiagnosed cases. So diagnostics is the soft spot. And also, once the cancers are diagnosed, they will not be treated. So in our system, health system, in a few months, when the COVID wave subsides, we will see patients knocking at the door who are not able to make it under the normal circumstances. And even the normal circumstances are quite delayed in Poland with the cancer diagnosis. So they will be more advanced. They will require more invasive, more varied intervention. They will require hospitalization. They will require more resources, which we'll have to apportion. And I'm afraid that it will not be an easy shift. These patients will be more expensive. Why? I think that results from some organizational factors, despite the fact that some oncological centers, and I also am quite privy and aware of some of the oncological centers. For us, it is a priority to make sure that the COVID is not affecting too much on the oncological patients. We don't want this cancer unit to be affected by some organizational changes due to COVID, or we are creating some COVID beds in this unit. We are trying to prevent it. And also we are trying to make sure that COVID is not infecting our patients, quite the virus infection that is not occurring. This is another concern that we have, because we have a group of very vulnerable patients who is very susceptible to this risk. The infection of coronavirus in these patients may have even far more reaching consequences than in regular patients, without getting into too much detail. And we see that despite the fact that National Institute of Oncology is going full steam, I know from the persons that our center has 120%. We see that we have some people from across Poland with neutropenic fever coming to our center, because in some smaller centers which don't have this experience, which don't have this force and this protection in oncology, these patients were mistakenly taken as COVID patients because they were running high fever, and they were referred to the COVID hospital. But then the COVID hospital says, this is a child with cancer, we cannot treat her. And we had to transport one of the young girls across the whole Poland, and she was rescued in our center. There is more and more stories like that. There is more and more narratives like that. And I think that Professor Rutkowski will confirm that. Another factor, apart from the organizational factor, is a psychological factor. People steering clear of hospitals and doctors if they have a choice to go for a visit. If they can postpone, even if they can avoid it, they do it. Why? Because they are afraid, and they realize that a hospital is a place where the risk is higher due to the fact that there is a number of people, that there is medical personnel who works in different places. So we have the collision of two factors, and also we have some past problems coming to us, which is haunting us. The person working at a number of centers, or insufficient number of medical professionals who need to help us, and all that is coming back to haunt us. And that is exacerbating this medical debt, with which we'll have to do something in a couple of months when we are all vaccinated and we are living under more or less normal circumstances, and we can go to get a coffee after such a session. And now moving on to Professor Rutkowski, I wanted to ask about the comment, because Professor Rutkowski wanted to say something clearly. Well, the drop in the drug program, we don't see that, but that is a result of the fact that most of the drug programs are being done in the large oncological centers, and this is the main reason. So the most advanced technologically, but also most advanced patients are covered with this care, because we have a system under which these oncological centers are focusing on one disease, so they are well protected. But large hospitals or smaller hospitals, this is where we see a big problem with diagnosis. I think that mainly refers to lung cancer, which is quite difficult and challenging to diagnose. When we have this combined with COVID, we'll have a huge problem with that in the near future, and the fact that the patients will accumulate and some of the patients will never get to get a treatment. We see already how many more advanced patients are knocking at our doors. This is just basic truth, and there is no doubt about it. I wanted to refer to one more thing. Professor Czech mentioned about the simplified RTDL. Medical fund is not solving it, because RTDL was not serving a purpose of solving the so-called rare cancers. Unfortunately, this instrument is not a good solution, because the common cancer which are dealt with by this instrument, RTDL, they will use up all the 3% which is allocated for that, and it will be even more difficult. I think it is a good idea that we have this medical fund, but because it replaces the RTDL mechanism, or it accelerates the use of the means, but on the other hand, it may lead to the lack of funds for RTDL which existed. So I don't think this is such a simple silver bullet. If we don't have a good solution for common cancer, then the medical fund will face a problem. Now, with regards to what's been happening when it comes to inequalities, a good example in prophylactics would be to introduce the digital mammographs. We see an increasing number of digital mammographs being purchased, because that enables to centralize the quality control, because it is easy when we create a repository, a database, then we could see whether we have interval cancers which have been omitted due to the poor quality of interpretation of the image. But what also COVID exposed with a great precision is the insufficient number of personnel. And in this insufficient number of personnel, we face even bigger problems. The patients are not only psychologically avoiding the care, but they are also struggling to find the personnel. The number of patients per doctor increased, even though I thought it is just impossible. So I think that our colleagues from abroad, if they knew the statistics on the burden of patient per doctor and nurse, they would be really shocked, surprised, because I don't think we can enlarge it even more. This is a huge problem which we do not know how to solve after pandemic subsides. Professor, I just wanted to ask, there's a problem with this current issue. Yesterday, Minister Niedzielski, Minister of Health, presented some recovery plan for health, and oncology was one of the 4 pillars. How do you assess this recovery plan? Because I don't think you were surprised. Well, we participated. We consulted 1 month ago, so every day is necessary to implement it. What I'm driving at in the context of what you just said, the lack of personnel and the organizational difficulties under the current COVID situation, how does this affect the assumptions? Because I understand if it wasn't for the COVID, we would have a different situation. Well, the general financial situation of the oncology centers is another problem, since it was not facing any constraints under DLO card. So when the DLO cards were reduced by 50%, that means that we will have a huge gap in the budgets of the oncological centers, and that is seen in most if not all oncological centers which are public. So the situation is quite bad. So the financial activities that the minister has presented yesterday are important. The second is that we would have a coordination team to see what is the situation, because we don't know what is the bad situation in Mazovian region, because where do we get this knowledge from? We just don't know it. We don't know. We know what is our situation, but we don't know what is the overall. What is the situation in Shedlce or some other city? So this is we need to manage the flow of patients at the province level, and I hope that the teams will be created fast and will help with that. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask a question to Nienke Finstra about the medical fund, which is an element which was supposed to play a different role originally. Right now, in the context of COVID, it is becoming one of the elements of the money is apportioned in a different way.
Does the medical fund is currently able to somehow alleviate those inequalities that we're facing, or are there some tweaks or maybe some bigger changes that you would consider, worth considering?
First of all, state that the intention of the medical fund is great. We do not get additional resources for healthcare every day, so it's great that it's been acknowledged that more needs to be done when it comes to oncology and orphan disease in Poland. What we also see is that a lot of details still have to be finalized of the fund. A lot of provisions and detailed ways of how it will operate are not yet known. That's also why INFARMA has commissioned research on how several other initiatives like this all across Europe have worked. What are the learnings we can take from that? Dr. Riel also referred, for example, to pockets of excellence in Italy. Johnson referred to the UK, and there are more countries that have these initiatives. So we're looking into really what has worked well, what has not worked well, and what could work really well, adapting it to the Polish healthcare situation, which is different. That's also been stated several times this morning. And in wanting to be a constructive partner, INFARMA is doing that research so we can really bring the insights of that forward when the details of the medical fund will be shaped. Because the real value of the medical fund will depend on how the exact provisions will be formulated. Also here, I think it will help to have a bold objective, like we discussed for the National Cancer Strategy. The same is for the medical fund. What would be the overarching objective of what we would like to achieve? And can we align on that so that we can all prioritize in the same way? Because also the objectives of the medical fund are fast. So how can we really speak the same language there? And also here, referring to medical guidelines would be a great way to start. What is really important to point out as well is that the procedures that would be drafted for the medical fund should be simple. Also, the FPA Ventura report on oncology care shows that really there's so many different hurdles in the Polish access situation. It's not just the reimbursement. The real time for patient access is long and is made difficult by subsequent steps, which are sometimes complex and not even always fully understood. So having specific provisions in the medical fund that would be simple and that will allow a specific faster trajectory for products that really offer a better value for patients would be very much needed. Because in oncology, even more than in any other indication, every day counts. So let's make sure that the provisions drafted there will allow for progress in that field so that we do not have those inequalities in diagnostics in treatment that we currently see, and through that can improve really the healthcare outcomes of Polish patients in oncology as well.
Thank you. We're shortly coming to an end. We have 5 minutes left, and I would like to finish up with a round again of short question and probably not so short but brief answers to bring in a bit more of an optimistic tone to our conversation. Wiemy dużo na temat wyzwań.
We know a lot about challenges. We've heard a lot about challenges. We know what needs to be done. We know where certain gaps are and where still there is some room to improve things. But I feel that that we are in a productive mood, so to say, even though the situation overall is not simple. But if you were to indicate what is the biggest chance, what is the biggest opportunity now, what can accelerate certain processes, facilitate them, for instance, the sort of low-hanging fruit that is very often mentioned in various strategies. Also, what are the bottlenecks that could be quickly eradicated? First, we'll start with Professor Czech. It's a difficult question, really, because it seems that we have a lot already diagnosed, so to say. So we have diagnosed much already, to use the medical speak. Namely, we have a lot of good documentation. We have national oncology strategy on the table. We have Ventura report mentioned by the director here, and we have multiple other documents. We have drug policy, and I think it's a good modern European document. And I think that there are two elements here. One is a dialogue and decision-making based on the diagnosis that we have. So what can be done in the most quick, cost-effective way? And I'm talking not necessarily about money, I'm talking about resources. So what can be done to make the system more effective and more efficacious? And it can be done because a lot of these documents has specific indicators, monitoring indicators to monitor progress. It's there, it's already inbuilt. So that's the first element. The second one would be courage. Being brave, because you said that we are all very productive in our moods, and I would like to see more productivity and courage in our decision makers. So if we diagnose something, it doesn't necessarily have to be that way, but if we diagnose that we need an amendment of the Reimbursement Act because it's going to facilitate many processes, despite the risks associated with it, let's do it. Let's amend it. If we need to make a decision about, I don't know, moving something because we see that oncology centers are overloaded at the highest level of reference care, perhaps we should move some of therapy and diagnostics to somewhere earlier on the patient's road, so that they can be used earlier on by physicians who are not necessarily specialized fully in this area. Of course, that's going to mean additional needs for consults, education, and so on and so forth. But perhaps these simple solutions could help. Like, for instance, if we've got biological drugs, perhaps they could be included in chemotherapy catalog, because that would limit the burden of data analyses. So, and this is a very scarce resource, so it should be used, not to mention that access would be better that way, and prices, as far as we know, with biosimilars, with biosimilar meds are reduced to 30–40%, so Poland could afford it to put these biosimilars into a chemotherapy catalog. So I would say open dialogue and courage to take action, because we should be courageous at the age of pandemic. We are fighting multiple attackers now. The coronavirus is one of them, but it's leading the whole army of other combatants. And so we have to face them and we have to win. You can win. You can win, and I can prove that. Professor Rutkowski, sitting here with us, is extremely successful in terms of treating melanoma. And we might say, well, yeah, you know, he's got great therapies on his hands, so he's succeeding. Yes, but it's also the matter of organization around drug programs, around diagnostics. It's just working, it's operating. So if we want to be optimistic and end on an optimistic note, this is an optimistic example that I would like to throw in. Thank you, Professor.
I'd like to direct the question again to Linke. What would you see as a large opportunity. I mean, Professor Czech mentioned those big ideas and then this boldness that I feel everyone will agree. But what else would you see as an opportunity in the current situation?
I think the time has also come to implement a lot of e-health solutions in a dramatic way, almost dramatic in the sense of doing it on multiple indications and multiple disease areas. We have also, like last week, there was a webinar with Innova and Praxedas RP where a speaker was from Kaiku. It's an e-health solution in oncology. And it is a tool that will allow patients to monitor their symptoms, so it empowers them. It allows for decision-making between healthcare professionals and patients in an easy way, reducing stress from patients, but also significantly improving outcomes because doctors, we know every day counts, we mentioned it before, are able to take treatment decisions earlier for their patients. But it also allows for more efficient healthcare resources. Having this app, for example, reduced the usage of nurses in those centers significantly. It's already been pointed out also by Professor Rutkowski that our biggest challenge right now is the amount of healthcare workers we have, especially in COVID times. So these solutions improve outcomes, empower patients, optimize healthcare resource, and reduce stress of patients. And this is also done remotely, which is fantastic also to start piloting now in this COVID times. A lot of these solutions exist in other countries. They've been proven to work. So why not use this momentum now when everyone wants to invest in healthcare, realizes how important it is, especially in COVID times, to start implementing those? Because with these solutions, we can address several projects of several challenges with one solution. And I think in terms of, we don't only need ambition, we also need to be smart to find those solutions that will allow us to address several challenges at the same time. So this one would be a proposed one from INFARMA side.
Sounds great. Pan Professor Rutkowski, mamy odwagę.
Now over to Professor Rutkowski. We've got courage, we've got e-technologies. Yes, we have it all, I think. And I'm sure we are going to do that. And also thank you to Professor Czech for his nice words. But there are two things here. The first one is, well, thank God we've got a strategy. We had it before the pandemic, because if you have that document, it means that you have to execute it. If it's there, it has to be executed, and we will execute it. Perhaps with certain delay, but it will be executed. So that's thing number one. Thing number two is, well, we've heard multiple times today that oncology is a common effort of multiple stakeholders. But in medicine, unfortunately, we have to base whatever we do on GPs, on general practitioners. It's impossible to do prevention, to do, anything sensible in terms of primary, secondary prevention, and also care post-treatment without participation of GPs. Nowhere in the world has it worked like that. Unless we start doing that and stop thinking that 800 clinical oncologists and 600 radiation therapy specialists are going to handle oncology care for the entire country, and a million people who are either diagnosed and during the disease without participation of GPs, that's not going to be done. It's not going to be handled. And this is one of the elements that we have to start doing, really implement it starting the beginning of next year. It's not about, training all the time and employing oncology vigilance. No, we have to do it all the time. We're talking about a sort of a post-COVID balance, but it's not that. It's normal medical practice. Every patient under the care of a GP has to be evaluated from the point of view of malignancies as well. So they have to have cancer prevention. Without it, we will fail, but I hope we will succeed anyhow. So this is, I think, a good summary. So coordination within the system, technologies and courage. Right, thank you so much to everyone. Thank you to the panelists for a very interesting discussion. Thank you to our audience, our viewers and listeners, also to our patrons in INFARMA and our partners, Novartis, Pfizer, Roche, Lilly, Takeda, Bayer and Ipsen. Also, on a private note, those of you who have not followed our newsletter, the status of pandemic, you can find it on our website every day, 5 key messages regarding coronavirus at 5 p.m. in your mailbox if you request it. So thank you for now. Have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you again. Thank you.
widzenia.